So, last week when I was watching the 9 worst superhero movies ever made, and Morbius, I obviously had to watch Superman 4. But I thought that rather than just seeing that on its own, I should probably watch the other ones just to have something to compare it to. And I was really surprised at how much I love them, mostly. So now I want to talk about Superman movies. So consider this like a bit of a follow-up to the last video, except I cannot tell you how refreshing it is to be able to talk about good movies after all that. This time again, I'm going to be sticking only to theatrical releases, which knocks out about 100 animated films. And though there are those ones from the 40s that were released in cinemas, they're more film serials in that they're like episodes of a show that they sort of just play together. So I guess they shouldn't really count. And also ones that are solely about Superman, so that on that technicality, I don't have to watch Dawn of Justice. So basically, these ones. So, I have something embarrassing to admit before we go on. Up until like a month ago when I started watching these movies, I was one of those people that didn't like Superman because I thought he was boring. I know, what an exciting and original opinion. But Richard Donner's 1978 Superman is honestly one of the most magical movies I've seen in a while. And I know saying that does make it sound like I'm being a little bit over the top, but I will genuinely stand by that. This was the most expensive movie ever made at the time, and it definitely paid off. Because even though the effects look expectedly a little bit silly by today's standards, I still think this movie looks pretty good. Aside from the perfect casting, one of my other favorite things about it are the sets. They're also incredibly designed, like the Fortress of Solitude or Lex Luthor's underground train station lair with its own pool that I would live in a heartbeat. Before it even gets to the Superman stuff, we get to see Krypton being exploded as gratuitously as possible, and then a piece of Clark's childhood where we get to see him meet the Kents for the first time without pants on, and Pa Kent gets to give one fatherly speech and then immediately dies. What I found really interesting about it is that Superman doesn't really fight anyone in this movie, and the big finale is just him going around trying to stop an earthquake that Lex caused, which of course leads to the infamous scene where he just flies around the earth really fast and turns back time. But the movie gets away with an ending that ridiculous because the rest of it is just so good. And it's so bizarre because the only reason that Richard Donner was chosen as the director of Superman at all was because the original guy got done for tax fraud. Richard Donner's original plan was to film Superman 1 and 2 back to back, but after having very vague disagreements with the producers, he ended up leaving, and so they brought in some other guy called Richard to finish it instead. Richard Lester adds in a lot more comedic elements to Superman 2 with like slapstick humor and lighthearted jokes, but there's still a lot here that feels like the original, and I almost love it just as much. It continues directly on from the opening of the first movie and follows on from what happens after General Zod and the other Kryptonians escape the Phantom Zone. Lois finally realizes that Clark is Superman in this one, and their relationship in the movie is wonderful and one of my favorite parts about it. But at the end, they kind of resolve it a bit weirdly because, of course, you can't know that he's Superman, so they have him just have the ability to make you forget stuff if he makes out with you. There's definitely way more of an emphasis on action in this one, as when the three come to Earth, there is just an unbelievable amount of destruction, which Superman can't even do anything about because earlier in the movie, he discovers that the Fortress of Solitude, for some reason, has an inbuilt power remover, which can permanently make him a normal human, and Clark just immediately goes for it with zero hesitation.
Excuse me, sir, would you care to step outside?
Clark.
I said, excuse me, sir, would you care to step outside?
If you listen closely enough, you can actually hear the post-nut clarity. With Superman not being around for a bit, it's extremely entertaining watching Zod and the others just destroying absolutely everything they come into contact with nothing to stand in their way except this one Daily Planet employee who goes and throws a filing cabinet at them. Of course, Clark eventually gets his powers back so he can fight Zod, but I don't think they really ever explain how. He kind of just goes back to the fortress and looks sad, and then the next time we see him, he's back to normal. Maybe it was a cutscene or something, I don't know, but I thought it was weird. The power eraser, of course, comes back later when Clark lures the Kryptonians to the fortress and then uses it on them. But then he goes and kills them anyway in cold blood despite them not being a threat anymore. But then, in 2006, they actually did release the original version of Superman 2 before Richard Lester joined on, which was the Donner Cut. They made this by restoring deleted scenes and even by filming some brand new ones based off the script with stand-in actors. And for the most part, I didn't even notice. The Donner Cut feels like a sped-up version of Superman 2, which is very strange considering how much the original movie takes its time. Most of it is pretty much the same, but they do sort of rearrange some of the scenes and move things up a bit. Like now, in her quest to test that Clark is Superman, they not only have Lois Lois attempting to commit suicide, they also have a fucking shoot him with a gun. The ending is different too, which has Superman turning back the Earth again, which I suppose makes more sense than a magic memory kiss. But even though it was silly in the original movie, at least it didn't erase the entirety of the film. They do explain a bit better how he gets his powers back in this one, as there's now a scene where Jor-El is waiting for him at the fortress, knowing that he would eventually realize that being a human sucks. Maybe it could be because I'd seen the original so recently, but I honestly overall think I prefer the theatrical version. But it's still worth giving this a watch just to see how the two are different. For Superman 3, Richard Lester took over entirely, and so those comedic elements of 2 become basically the entire movie. I didn't really have a problem with the comedy bits though, which are a lot of people's reasons for not liking 3 very much as far as I know, but where this one lost me was in the second half with the evil Superman stuff. Since Gene Hackman skipped out on this one, and because they knew they couldn't make a villain better than him, this time they just made the bad guy Superman. The minor villains are some random businessmen who recruit a computer programmer called Gus Gorman, who ends up fucking up the kryptonite recipe and turns Superman evil. But not like an Injustice where he murders people, more in the way that he just uses his powers to be a huge dick to everybody around him for absolutely no reason. And they even make him have sex with some random woman who I'm surprised didn't die.
Well, I hope you don't expect me to save you, because I don't do that anymore.
They like wash out the colors on his costume and give him a beard to make him look more evil. It's so dumb. The original plan was to include Brainiac and Mr. Mix... What the fuck?
My name is Mrs. Spitlick.
There we go. But Warner Brothers rejected it because they thought it would be a better idea for Superman to fight a giant computer. Which, no, it really wasn't. I think the first half of Superman 3 is pretty good. I thought some of the jokes were really funny, and they do try and make this one a bit different by having Clark return to Smallville and having this weird sort of half romance with an old classmate.
Oh, Clark, that's Buster's dog food.
Good.
But that does mean that Lois is only in this one for like 0.5 seconds in the beginning and end, which is not a plus. It just kind of gets exhausting by the end, and in a weird way after the first two, I'm genuinely kind of offended by how they made him evil in this one. Like, it just feels wrong.
You know, it's unusual finding a good-looking girl like you alone like this.
I just think it's dumb that they had to go and tarnish the image of Superman they built up in the other two movies just because they couldn't come up with a better idea for a villain. Now, obviously Superman 4 should be next here, but since I literally just talked about it in the last video, but skipped the lower rated Supergirl because I'm a loser, I thought I might talk about Supergirl instead here a little bit because I finally watched it. Really planned that one out well, huh? How long has it been playing Red Letter Media? I haven't even noticed. I left autoplay on. No! Oh, that's so embarrassing. I'm not redoing all those takes. I'm just leaving it in. Helen Slater stars as Superman's cousin from a colony of other Kryptonians who I guess just also survived Krypton exploding. Kind of takes away from the dramaticness of that whole sole survivor of his race thing. She comes to Earth not in search of Clark, but instead some sphere device that somehow ended up there. But that wasn't the only ball that was dropped in this movie. Ayo! In this, Supergirl does battle with a witch and Satan, while also falling in love with some gardener who is definitely way too old for her for me to be comfortable with. Christopher Reeve was meant to have an appearance in this one, but inconspicuously dropped out super early on into production. Pretty good hindsight there. So they just say in the beginning that Superman is off somewhere in some other galaxy, so he doesn't have to be here.
Superman has indeed embarked on a special peace-seeking mission to a galaxy scientists estimate may be several hundred trillion light years from our own.
He and the other characters do get plenty of mentions throughout though. Like when Kara disguises herself as a student, she befriends Lois Lane's sister, and Jimmy Olsen from the other movies even shows up in this one, and is also dating a schoolgirl that is definitely way younger than him. Guys, stop. I don't think Supergirl necessarily does anything like wrong. I just really wasn't engaged by it, and it made it feel like the longest 2 hours of my life. Definitely would rate this below Superman 4, because even the worst parts of that are at least really funny.
Is the world gonna be vaporized? No, Luther. It's as it always was, on the brink, with good fighting evil. See you in 20.
Superman will never...
And then 20 years passed before we got a new Superman movie, while Batman got like 15. There were a few attempts at doing something in the meantime, like with the Nicolas Cage fronted Superman Lives, or with J.J. Abrams' Superman Flyby that were never to be, both of which I've also already talked about before. But eventually Warner Brothers decided to go with a sort of sequel, sort of reboot to the Donner movies, with X-Men director Bryan Singer, Brandon Routh as Superman, and Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor.
You're bald.
Returns doesn't acknowledge any of the other movies directly, and so could really be vaguely inserted kind of just after any of them, but apparently it's meant to only follow up to the first two. Here, Superman comes back to Earth after 5 years of trying to find survivors on Krypton, but obviously hadn't heard that Supergirl isn't canon anymore, and comes back to find the worst possible scenario, that Lois married James Marsden. I can't say this one feels quite the same as the Donna films, but they do have little gags and bits in there that feel like they'd be straight out of the originals. Return steps back quite a bit to focus on a simpler story of just Superman and Lex and not some fucking magic supercomputer, and there's much more attention given to him saving people instead of punching them. The final battle involves Clark getting his ass handed to him by a bunch of Lex's goons on a kryptonite island, which I suppose is the Kryptonian equivalent of beating up a cancer patient, and the big triumphant moment is him lifting the island and throwing it into space, even though it's big enough to probably cause a fucking extinction event on some other planet. Thanks, Superman. I'm fairly sure one of the major complaints about Returns is that there's not really enough of Superman fighting anybody. In fact, I think he goes through the entire thing without ever throwing a single punch, just like in the original. And that's actually one of the things I appreciate the most about it. They really commit to sticking to the strength of the 78 movie, even if it kind of went against what people were used to with other superhero movies at the time. And even if Returns isn't my favorite of the bunch, I still wanted to give it credit for that. The biggest outlier in this one is that they introduced that Lois's kid is actually Superman's, because at one point he murders somebody by pushing a piano into them.
First blood.
But then the movie ends without them ever acknowledging it or telling James Marsden about it at all. Like, guys? There's also a bit of a clash with how they cast younger actors, so they could obviously use the movie as a stepping off point for sequels, but it's kind of at odds with how everyone here is meant to be old and from the 70s. A sequel was in the works at some point, with Brainiac and Bizarro being floated as the villains, but ultimately, even though Returns made just shy of $400 million and even outgrows Batman Begins, Warner Brothers still considered it a failure. Alright. So then lastly, we have the most openly discussed Superman movie, which is Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. I can't say I've ever been the biggest fan of the 3.5 movies Snyder's done for DC, but I actually liked Man of Steel a lot more the second time, as it's the only one in this video I'd actually seen before. Maybe that's why I didn't like Superman. To get the most obvious thing out of the way that everybody has to talk about, yes, there is an unbelievable amount of destruction in this movie. It's like to make up for the complaints about the lack of action in Returns, they just do not stop with it for the entire movie. Man of Steel feels totally different to the other movies, which for the most part are very much in line with each other. There's more of an emphasis on like the human perspective of what our reactions would be to seeing a man that is just this buff. And this is what?
I just think he's kind of hot.
Yeah, literally like half of IMDb's trivia on the movie is just about Henry Cavill being shirtless, and honestly, I can't blame them. Similar to Batman Begins, there are scenes of some of the adversities that Clark faced as a child, like when some kid called him Dick Splash.
Dick Splash.
But he gets his revenge many years later by making orphans out of half of Metropolis. At least Jonathan Kent survives more than one fatherly monologue this time. I do really like Henry Cavill as Superman. I just wish his character was a bit warmer. I think for me, what Man of Steel needed was just more scenes of Superman saving people. And like there are some in the beginning and especially in the childhood segments, but I just feel like Superman maybe would have stopped that truck from hitting that building. I'm not saying it's not fucking cool, but my God, those poor people.
Look, I'm here to help.
This one is super visual effects heavy, and I do understand why people say they find this one exhausting, but honestly, the fight scenes are one of my favorite parts because they feel like live-action Dragon Ball fights. This is the most controversial Superman movie that I can think of, and I think for very understandable reasons. I totally understand how both sides of the argument feel about this one, with like the people that think Man of Steel is complete shit and entirely misunderstands the Superman character, and the people who love it because they think it's really cool. I think I'm just kind of in the middle. I do like it, just for very different reasons for why I like the Donner movies. But yeah, I feel like there's not really much I can say about it after like 8 years of discourse on Man of Steel, so I thought it was fine, but I totally get why people hate it. So anyway, those are my thoughts on these 6 theatrical Superman movies as someone who literally doesn't know anything about Superman. I don't really have a flashy outro this time, so just thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.